Hi, I'm Finley, and thank you for coming to my TED Talk on how music affects key human functions. So before I begin, I'd like to show you this quote by Bob Marley, who said, "One good thing about music is when it hits you, you feel no pain." So I chose this topic for a number of reasons, namely because I love music and I love listening to music and playing it, but also I've always been fascinated with music. More specifically, been fascinated with how I can create these connections that are seemingly more intense than any communicative connection I can make in just 10 minutes of playing music with a few people. So I examined my research in 3 parts. First, I looked at the psychology of music and how it affects each part of the brain. Then I looked at, more specifically, the neural processing behind that and why that happens. And then lastly, I looked at the role of music in human evolution to try and understand exactly why, to try and paint the bigger picture of why music affects us like this. So to start, we need to understand how music is processed in the brain. So sound waves are individually picked up in the ear and essentially reverse engineered into the brain, into what we call music. And that's stored in the auditory cortex, which deals with most of the hearing processing that we do. But as you're about to find out, the auditory cortex is far from the only part of the brain that is responsible for processing music. So that leads me into my first topic, which is music psychology. As you can see here, I got this image from the Michael J. Fox Parkinson Foundation. And as you can see here, the brain's reaction to music shows an immense more amount of activity in the brain than a brain that's listening to just silence, no music. So of all of my research, I've been able to localize it into 4 main areas of the brain. These deal with cognition, which encompasses memory, thinking, learning, that kind of thing. Then emotion and pleasure, which deals with not only dopamine, but also the parts of the brain that regulate dopamine the most, and also the parts of the brain that deal with emotion, like the amygdala. I also have the rhythm and motor functions of the brain, which deal with the motor functions, the parts of the brain that deal with body movement, coordination, that kind of thing, as well as rhythm. And audition, which is definitely the least touched on, but that's more in the brainstem and deals with the actual playing of music and the perception of if you like the music. So to be more specific, I'd like to
hit escape. Yeah, and then just move the arrow up there.
Oh no. Obviously weird.
It's weird because it's a split screen.
Oh. Okay, thank you. Can you also scroll down for me?
Just use the mouse scroll.
Okay.
No, the mouse. On the mouse.
Okay.
There's a little scroll.
Oh,
Here,
I don't know.
let me run your tab for you for a minute.
I'm sorry.
No, you're good. That's fine.
I'll just start going off the top.
Yep.
So, as this
Give us-
diagram will soon show us.
Clicking, yes.
Yes.
Go.
Oh, you copied it.
Oh my god. There we go. Okay.
Okay.
Come here.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, and then just use the mouse to
Okay.
go to where you want to go.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, so sorry about that. The reason I'm directing you to this is because it's a very helpful website by UCF to examine the psychology of music. So I've already talked about the auditory cortex, which lies in the temporal lobe, but I'd also like to show you a couple more things that kind of show how music affects the brain. So the Broca's and Wernicke's area are both involved in the structure and analyzation of speech and written language. And these are extremely important and activated when listening to music mainly for the reason that music is highly correlated to language, and the human brain has a tendency to structure music like language and language like music. So when listening to music, it's analyzing it in the structure of a conversation, picking up the emotion, the accents, every single part of it. Next, I have the occipital lobe, which deals with visual information, but also imagination and visualization. In my research, I've found that in musicians, especially professional musicians, when they're playing music, they're not only processing it with their auditory cortex and hearing it, but they're also visualizing the note and the space between each note almost as much as they're hearing. Next, I have the amygdala and the hippocampus, which deal with emotion and memory, respectively. The amygdala deals with emotion, and the hippocampus, which straddles around and also helps regulate the emotion, as well as deals with memory. These are two of the single most affected parts of the brain by music. One example is if you've ever listened to a song from your childhood and it took you right back to that moment and right back to that feeling even. That's a direct response from the hippocampus, and if you feel that same response, that's just the amygdala's direct response from it. The last ones I'd like to talk about are the cerebellum, which coordinates, which deals with muscle movement and muscle memory, and the putamen, which to me is the single most interesting part of the brain in terms of music. It works with the cerebellum in terms of coordination and muscle movement, but it also is specifically dedicated to processing rhythm. So one real life way we can see this is in Parkinson's treatment, where patients lack the ability to move anymore. But music that stimulates rhythm in the part of the brain that deals with rhythm also stimulates that movement. And in many, many cases, people who can't even get out of their wheelchair can get up as soon as they hear rhythmic music. Okay. I'm gonna move back to my slideshow if possible.
Yeah.
So I showed you this to give you an overview of the psychology behind music, because it is a very broad topic and you need to understand it. So the second part of research I looked at was neural processing, which is what happens when there's that heightened brain activity. It's the why behind and the how of why music enhances your brain activity. So the neural pathways of the brain incorporate sensory, motor, and hormonal processes of the brain. Uncoincidentally, these incorporate all of the processes of the brain, and certainly all of the processes involved in musical processing. So I'd like to touch on how this works, which is through dopamine, essentially. Dopamine, which regulates pleasure, is essentially what unlocks the neural pathways. When you like something, especially music, it allows neural processing to take place through these pathways and enhance the brain and increase efficiency and blood flow. And when you dislike something, it kind of just shells up and doesn't let it in. One way we can see this is through the study I looked at examining original music, which just is some pleasurable music they played for participants, and altered music, which is less predictable and generally less enjoyable music that for a reason caused less dopamine. As you can see, the orange being the original music, due to just the pleasure that this music induced, an immense amount of more activity was seen in the brain than just basically very similar music that just wasn't as good. Now, this leads me into my third and final topic. which is music and human evolution. So I decided to research this in correlation with my topic because I wasn't satisfied understanding how music works in the brain. I wanted to know why it's such a central part of humanity. Where we can see such an amount of activity in the brain from listening and creating music, it doesn't make sense that it would just be an art medium that we stumbled upon. So I decided to look into the anthropological research and psychological research of our ancestors in correlation with modern music and humans. So one of the first things I found in my research is that the auditory cortex and system, which I briefly touched on, is the primary system in infants to be developed. It's the first thing that humans develop in their entire body, is the ability to hear and process that sound. And it's basically completely developed by the time an infant is born, which is remarkable and much faster than any other system of the body. So it was difficult to find a lot of evidence in my research because it's from 250,000 years ago and stuff wasn't even written down yet. But I looked at a lot of studies and theoretical evidence. Now, one study I looked at examined mammalian brains' response to music, not just humans. So this specific one looks at rhesus monkeys versus humans. And what was interesting about this study is that these monkeys did exceptionally well on rhythm and time. In fact, they did equally as good as humans in the study, which was really surprising to me because I thought that music was a localized thing for humans. But it makes sense when you think about mammals and echolocation and all these things that have evolved over time. But the other interesting part of this study was pitch. The monkeys performed terribly at pitch and could not predict at all any sort of pitch. Now, I don't exactly know what that's supposed to mean in my evidence, but it's important because it shows us the insights into the mammal brain. Humans are not alone in responding to music, and certainly sound, and have evolved that way for a specific reason. However, this kind of shows us how the human brain is distinct and understands pitch, likely as a result of the evolution of language as well, whereas other mammals don't speak. This is a Neanderthal flute. I don't know why. But it's pretty old, so it's cool. So this brings me into my first claim, which is that music enhances the brain. It does. It's proven. It can use to treat many disorders, especially Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. And it's because of dopamine, basically strictly. The amount of neural processing that occurs in the brain when listening to music is drastically increased, but only when you like that music. If you dislike the music, while I've found no negative impacts of it, it doesn't really do anything. And dopamine is kind of what unlocks the music into the brain. And your brain says, okay, well that's good, and lets it in, and lets it get processed, and does all these things for your brain, like increase blood flow, reduce blood pressure, increase the amount of efficiency in the neurons, and even increase gray and white matter, which is the actual physical substance of your brain. As I've talked about, it affects a wide array of brain functions, almost all of them, and plays a crucial role in the actual reward system of our day-to-day lives. One example of this is something I looked at when I was writing my thesis, done by the National Library of Medicine. This team of researchers did a study where they administered a chemical dopamine called levodopa and chemical dopamine decreasers called risperidone. And those were two groups, and that was compared to a placebo group where they thought they were getting increased dopamine. And these results are very straightforward and expected. People who took dopamine and were high off of dopamine liked the music a lot more than those who had way less dopamine. That's not unexpected, but it is very important in understanding the role of dopamine here, because something that you don't like just can't work for you. If you dislike this music, it will not help you, whether you have Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, whether you're just listening to music. So this brings me into my second claim, which is that music is very correlated with language and structure and can really help us understand language and structure as well as emotion. One study to show this shows musical aptitude and kind of musical intelligence that they compared with a number of things that included language, speech, writing, and emotional intelligence. As you can see, there is an obvious positive correlation between the two. That one's for Kyle. Another one that I looked at was musicians versus non-musicians' brain. In using the same amount of measurability, language, speech, writing, and emotional intelligence. As you can see here, there is a lot more activity in the musician's brain. This is all involved in the amygdala, hippocampus, and emotion and memory, but also in the Broca's area, which involves speech, and demonstrated a higher amount of brain density and gray matter in the musician's brain than the non-musician. So, with what I've claimed so far, what are the broader implications of this? I've talked about them a bit as we go. Talked about things like music therapy, which I specifically left out because in all of the research I've looked at, it's not speculative, it's true. Music does help relieve symptoms of Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, among other things. As I've also talked about, music gives us insights into communication that we perhaps wouldn't understand otherwise. Through my evolutionary research, I saw that music likely developed with language in the same time, in the same part of the brain, and may even predated language, and is responsible for how we communicate. I see this in my everyday life as I communicate with my band on a deeper level in 10 minutes without saying a single word. I think it's also worth to note the insights music can give us into the actual physics and math behind sound waves and how we can use that for medicine, structure, and many things, but I have not researched that. So, to conclude my thoughts, I'd like to bring you guys back to that Bob Marley quote at the beginning, who said, "When music hits you, you feel no pain." Now I stand before you today and can tell you this is because of dopamine's reaction to the amygdala. Thank you.